She walked into the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in New Haven, Connecticut on August 23, 1945, and she told them everything. She told them about the networks she had run inside the United States government, the sources she had cultivated at the Treasury Department and the War Production Board and the Office of Strategic Services. She told them about the dead drops in the coded telephone signals in the briefcase, full of microfilm that she had carried on the New York subway while government documents copied in the dead of night were riding in her handbag. She told them names, dozens of names, men and women with security clearances who had been feeding classified information to Moscow for years. The agent who took her statement that day could barely keep up with what she was saying. Her name was Elizabeth Bentley, and she was 37 years old. She had a graduate degree from Columbia University. She had spent the Depression years becoming a committed communist, had fallen into an intense love affair with a Soviet intelligence officer, and had spent the better part of a decade running one of the most productive espionage networks in American history. She was, by any objective measure, one of the most significant intelligence sources to walk through the FBI's door in the entire 20th century. And within a few years, powerful men in government and the press would be doing everything they could to make sure nobody believed a word she said. This is the story of a woman who told an uncomfortable truth, who paid an enormous personal price for telling it, and who waited 25 years, in mounting loneliness and obscurity, to be proven right. This is the story of Elizabeth Bentley, the spy the Cold War didn't know what to do with. To understand how she got to that FBI office in 1945, you have to go back to 1908, to the small town of New Milford, Connecticut, where Elizabeth Terrell Bentley was born, into a family that was respectable, educated, and quietly miserable. Her father was a newspaper editor, her mother a schoolteacher, and the family prided itself on propriety and appearances. Elizabeth was an only child in a household where emotional warmth was in short supply. Her mother died when she was still in her teens. Her father remarried and the new household suited her even less. She was bookish, awkward, and intensely ambitious, driven by a longing to belong somewhere that she would spend the rest of her life trying to satisfy. She excelled academically. She won a scholarship to Vassar College, one of the most prestigious women's colleges in the United States, graduating in 1930 into the teeth of the Great Depression. She went on to study in Florence, Italy, where she spent a year watching Benito Mussolini's fascistas consolidate power with casual brutality. That year in Italy mattered. She came back to the United States, genuinely frightened by what unchecked right-wing nationalism could do, and she arrived at Columbia University for her graduate studies in Italian language and literature at precisely the moment when American progressive politics was wrestling with the same fears, with the Communist Party of the United States, or CPUSA, had spent the early 1930s recruiting heavily on elite campuses. Their pitch was intellectually sophisticated and emotionally compelling, especially to young people who had watched the financial system collapse and leave millions of Americans destitute. The party offered an analysis of what had gone wrong and a vision of what could replace it. For someone like Elizabeth, with her European experience, her academic background, and her deep personal loneliness, the party also offered something else. It offered community. She joined the CPUSA in 1935. It was, at the time, a completely legal organization. She was 37 years old, had a graduate degree from Columbia University. She had spent the Depression years becoming a committed communist, had fallen into an intense love affair with a Soviet intelligence officer, and had spent the better part of a decade running one of the most productive espionage networks in American history. She was one in a generation of American intellectuals who looked at fascism rising in Europe, at capitalism seemingly failing at home, and concluded that radical change was not only desirable but necessary. That judgment was, in context, neither stupid nor immoral. It was, however, about to take her somewhere she had not fully imagined. In 1938, Elizabeth Bentley met a man named Jacob Golos. Golos was 45 years old, a compact, intense Ukrainian immigrant with a thick accent and a gift for inspiring absolute trust in the people around him. He ran a travel agency called World Tourists, which was in fact a front for Soviet intelligence operations. He was, under his unremarkable exterior, a senior officer of the Komintern, the Soviet organization that coordinated communist activities around the world. He was also, by most accounts of people who knew him, a genuinely charismatic and emotionally compelling figure. Elizabeth fell in love with him, deeply and completely. She would later describe the relationship as the central experience of her adult life. For a woman who had spent her years feeling like an outsider, being loved and trusted by a man like Golos was transformative, and Golos, whether out of genuine affection or calculated operational thinking, trusted her in return. He brought her into his work. She started small, as couriers often do. She picked up mail and delivered packages. She attended meetings that she was not supposed to remember attending. She learned the basic tradecraft of clandestine communication. The payphone calls made from specific booths at specific times, the signals that indicated whether a dead drop had been serviced, the art of surveillance detection, of walking a route through a city in a way that would reveal whether anyone was following you. And then, as the war in Europe expanded and the United States found itself suddenly in the fight, the work grew larger and more consequential. Golos began directing Elizabeth to serve as the primary contact for a network of sources inside the United States government. These were not low-level clerks. These were economists and analysts and policy advisors, people with access to genuinely sensitive information about American war strategy, industrial production, and diplomatic intentions. She met them in parks and diners and on street corners. She memorized their reports or carried the documents they handed her back to Golos. She was, by any professional intelligence standard, functioning as a case officer, managing a network of agents, keeping them productive and calm and committed, solving the operational problems that arose when nervous sources started having second thoughts. She did this while holding a legitimate job, maintaining a normal social life, and giving no outward sign of what she was doing in her spare time. The K.G.B, the Soviet security service that eventually absorbed Golos's network, referred to her by the code name Umnitsa, which translates roughly as clever girl. The condescension embedded in that code name tells you something about how Moscow viewed her. She was useful. She was not, in their minds, a peer. Jacob Golos died of a heart attack on Thanksgiving Day, 1943, at Elizabeth's apartment. She held his hand as he died. She was 35 years old, and the man who had been her lover, her handler, her protector, and the organizing center of her adult life was gone. What followed was one of the loneliest and most psychologically devastating periods she would ever describe. The K.G.B moved quickly to take over the network that Golos had been running, and they were not subtle about it. Soviet intelligence culture of that era regarded Americans, even committed communist Americans, with a fundamental suspicion. Americans were undisciplined, emotional, unprofessional. They talked too much and trusted too easily. The new handlers assigned to Elizabeth after Golos's death made clear, with polite but unmistakable contempt, that they considered her a security risk, an amateur who had been tolerated because of her usefulness but who did not merit genuine respect. They tried to cut her out. They attempted to contact her sources directly, going around her to establish independent relationships with the people she had recruited and managed. Some of her contacts were willing to cooperate with this transition. Others were loyal to her specifically, and not to the abstract because she represented. The K.G.B's clumsy takeover attempts created exactly the kind of disruption and anxiety that good intelligence tradecraft was supposed to prevent. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was grieving and frightened and increasingly aware that the organization she had served was treating her as a disposable asset. The ideological commitment that had sustained her through the 1930s had already been tested by events. The Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, which had required American communists to perform an ideological somersault almost overnight, had damaged the faith of many party members. The purges in the Soviet Union, the show trials, the disappearances of people who had been loyal communists until the party decided they weren't. These things had accumulated in the back of her mind. After Golos died, those doubts moved to the front. She spent 1944 drinking more than she should have, questioning what she was doing and why, and slowly arriving at a decision that, once made, would define everything that came after. She went to the F.B.I. The decision to defect was not made in a single dramatic moment. It was the product of months of internal erosion, of doubt accumulating layer by layer until the structure beneath her could no longer hold. But once she made it, she was thorough. The debriefing sessions that followed her initial contact in August 1945 were extensive. Elizabeth spent weeks with F.B.I. agents, reconstructing everything she knew about the networks she had managed. She provided names, real names, where she knew them. She described meeting locations, communication protocols, the kinds of information that had been passed, and to whom. She described the government offices where her sources worked, the positions they held, the access they had. The list was staggering. More than 150 individuals were eventually identified through her information, including some figures in quite senior positions. Among those she named were Harry Dexter White, a senior Treasury Department official who had helped design the post-war international financial system, and Lachlan Curry, an economic advisor who had worked directly in the White House. She named members of the Office of Strategic Services, which was the wartime precursor to the Central Intelligence Agency. She named people in the State Department, the War Department, the Justice Department. She was, in effect, describing a penetration of the United States government that was broader and deeper than almost anyone in official Washington wanted to believe. And that was the problem. The F.B.I. under J. Edgar Hoover took her information seriously and moved aggressively to investigate. But the F.B.I.'s relationship with the wider U.S. government was complicated, and the political climate of 1945 and 1946 was not one in which allegations of this scope were going to be received without fierce resistance. The Soviet Union was still, in the public mind, the heroic ally that had bled enormously to defeat Nazi Germany. The idea that committed American communists, people with idealism and ability, had been secretly working for Moscow while also serving in U.S. government positions was not a comfortable one. Some of the people she named had powerful friends. Others were protected by the simple fact that the evidence against them, while compelling two intelligence analysts who understood what they were looking at, was difficult to use in a court of law. Elizabeth's testimony was the testimony of a self-confessed spy. Her credibility could be attacked, And it was. When Elizabeth Bentley finally testified publicly before the Senate Subcommittee on Investigations in 1948, the reaction was extraordinary, and not in a good way. She was composed and specific on the stand. She named names again, publicly this time. She described her activities with a kind of operational detail that was hard to fabricate. She was clearly intelligent, clearly educated, and clearly had the kind of insider knowledge that could only come from direct participation in what she was describing. And almost immediately, the attacks began. She was called a fantasist, a neurotic, a spurned woman inventing grief. The phrase that stuck, the one that followed her for years, was Red Spy Queen, a label that managed to be dismissive and sensationalist at the same time, reducing a serious intelligence source to a tabloid character. Some of the people she named called her a liar publicly and loudly. Others implied, with great delicacy, that she was unstable. The gender dimension of what happened to her is impossible to ignore. A male defector in 1948 who came forward with comparable information would have faced scrutiny and skepticism too. That is the nature of intelligence work, where sources are never automatically trusted. But a male defector would not have been dismissed with language that framed his unreliability in terms of his emotional instability or his romantic history. He would not have been described, as Elizabeth repeatedly was, in terms that were essentially about his femininity being incompatible with serious credibility. Her relationship with Golos was used against her constantly. The implication was that a woman who had been seduced by a Soviet agent and then gone along with his activities was not a heroic whistleblower but a foolish romantic, a woman who let her heart override her judgment and now needed to be treated accordingly. The fact that her operational record demonstrated exactly the opposite of poor judgment, that she had managed complex intelligence networks with considerable skill for years, was inconvenient for this framing and was therefore mostly ignored. There was also a political dimension that had nothing to do with her gender. By 1948, the question of Soviet espionage in the United States was becoming a partisan battlefield. The Truman administration had reasons to be uncomfortable with the scale of what she was describing, because some of the people she named had served in Democratic administrations. The instinct to discredit her was not universal, but it was powerful, and it came from people with the influence to shape public perception. She drank, she struggled, she converted to Catholicism, seeking a framework of meaning and community to replace the one she had abandoned. She gave testimony over and over to various congressional committees and grand juries. Each time, she was subjected to renewed attacks on her credibility, renewed insinuations about her mental and emotional state. She was not imagining things. She was not lying. But in 1948 and 1949 and 1950, Shem could not prove it in a way that the people who wanted her silenced could not find ways to dispute. Then came Senator Joseph McCarthy, and things got worse in a different way. Did something paradoxical to Elizabeth Bentley's position. In one sense, McCarthy was confirming the reality that she had been describing for years. Soviet espionage was real. There had been communist agents inside the American government, but McCarthy's methods were so reckless, his allegations so often fabricated or inflated, that the entire subject became contaminated. The legitimate intelligence history that Elizabeth represented got swept into the same basket as McCarthy's political theater. Serious analysts who wanted to discuss the real history of Soviet penetration of the US government now had to fight through the association with McCarthyism to be taken seriously. And Elizabeth, who had come forward years before McCarthy and had named real people based on real operational knowledge, found herself lumped together with a movement whose credibility was rapidly collapsing. She was neither McCarthy's ally nor his victim. Exactly. She was something more complicated. A genuine historical source who had been co-opted into a political circus she had not sought and could not control. The personal cost accumulated steadily through the 1950s. She continued drinking. She taught at small colleges, trying to reconstruct something resembling a stable professional life. She wrote a memoir, published in 1951, called Out of Bondage, which told her story in her own words. The book sold modestly. It was reviewed with varying degrees of skepticism and condescension. It did not rehabilitate her reputation in the way she had hoped. The people she had named continued to deny everything. Some of them were genuinely innocent and had been incorrectly identified, and their anger at her was not unjustified. Others, she was quite certain, were guilty, and their denials were performances. She could not always tell, from the outside, which category any given individual fell into. And that uncertainty added another layer of torment to an already punishing situation. She died on December 3, 1963, in New Haven, Connecticut. She was 55 years old. She had spent the final years of her life teaching at the Long Lane School, a facility for troubled girls, in a career that had a certain melancholy symmetry to it. A woman who had gone her own troubled way through the world trying to help young women navigate theirs. The obituaries were brief. The vindication, when it finally came, arrived in a form that Elizabeth could not have anticipated. In 1995, the National Security Agency, or NSA, released a collection of decoded Soviet intelligence cables known as the Venona project. Venona was a long-running American signals intelligence effort that had intercepted and decrypted a substantial portion of K.G.B. and military intelligence cable traffic from the 1940s. The project had been classified for decades, its existence unknown to the public and to most of the government officials who had been arguing about Soviet espionage for 30 years. When the Venona cables were made public, they confirmed, in the K.G.B.'s own words, a significant portion of what Elizabeth Bentley had described. The cables used the cryptonyms, the Soviet cover names for American sources that she had known about. They described operational details that matched her accounts. They confirmed the activities of several of the individuals she had named, individuals who had spent years publicly insisting she was a liar. Harry Dexter White, who had died in 1948 shortly after his own congressional testimony, was confirmed as a Soviet source. She had been right. Substantially, materially, verifiably right. The woman who had been called neurotic, dismissed as a spurned romantic, and relegated to institutional obscurity had been telling the truth when it mattered. To people who had the power to do something about it, the intelligence historians who worked through the Venona materials in the years following their release were careful and measured in their assessments, as good historians should be. They noted that not every name Elizabeth provided was confirmed, that some individuals may have been misidentified or confused, that the picture was complex, but on the central claim that there had been a substantial and damaging Soviet intelligence penetration of the United States government in the 1940s, and that she had accurately identified a significant portion of the people involved. The Venona evidence was unambiguous. It was vindication that arrived 32 years after her death. She was not a hero in the uncomplicated sense. She committed espionage against the United States government for years, passing information to a foreign power that was, even during the wartime alliance, pursuing interests fundamentally opposed to American ones. The people she recruited and managed were real individuals who made real choices, and some of them suffered real consequences from her eventual testimony. The moral ledger of her life does not balance neatly, but the story of what happened after she went to the F.B.I. is worth sitting with, because it illuminates something important about how societies handle uncomfortable truths. Elizabeth Bentley told an uncomfortable truth, one that required acknowledging that the idealism of the Depression era had been exploited, that the progressive networks of New Deal Washington had been penetrated, that people in positions of trust had been serving two masters simultaneously. That truth was uncomfortable for people across the political spectrum, for liberals who did not want to believe their colleagues had been spies, and for anti-communists who found her complex, difficult, hard-to-control story less useful than simpler narratives. She was treated the way institutions often treat whistleblowers, especially female whistleblowers. She was attacked personally, in ways that a male counterpart would have been significantly less vulnerable to. Her emotional history was weaponized. Her reliability was questioned in terms that mapped directly onto contemporary anxieties about women's fitness for serious public roles. And the campaign to discredit her worked for decades, not because she was wrong, but because the people doing the discrediting had more power than she did. The Venona project changed that. The Soviet archives, partially opened after the Cold War ended, added additional confirmation. Historians like Haynes, Clare, and Weinstein spent years working through the declassified materials and reached conclusions that supported the substance of what she had said. Intelligence analysts today regard her as one of the most significant defectors of the early Cold War period, a source whose value was undermined not by the quality of her information but by the political and social dynamics of the moment she came forward. She is taught in intelligence studies courses as a case study in how political context can distort the reception of genuine intelligence, and how gender bias can compromise national security by leading evaluators to dismiss credible female sources. There is a detail from the final years of her life that intelligence historians have sometimes noted because of what it suggests about the strange, suspended quality of her existence. She was teaching troubled teenagers in Connecticut, while the people she had exposed were still giving interviews about their illustrious careers. She was trying to stay sober and find meaning while men she had named were receiving professional honors. She knew that what she had done mattered, knew it in her bones, because she had been there and she knew what she had seen. But the world around her gave her almost no confirmation of that knowledge. She was a woman who had told a true story that her era was not prepared to receive as true, and she spent the rest of her life living in that gap between what she knew and what she was permitted to be believed about. The Venona cables closed that gap. They did not give her back the years that were taken from her. They did not rehabilitate her in time for her to experience rehabilitation. But they did something important. They made her story part of the permanent historical record in a form that cannot be dismissed. Her name does not appear on any memorial wall. There is no federal building named for her, no intelligence service award bearing her name. The CIA does not celebrate her as a founding hero of American counterintelligence. even though her testimony, imperfectly received as it was, helped build the evidentiary foundation for understanding the scope of Soviet penetration during the war years. She was a woman who spent years in the most precarious possible position, knowing things that powerful people did not want known, and saying them anyway, and paying a price that lasted until her death. In the world of intelligence history, that kind of courage, complicated, morally ambiguous, battered by circumstance, is often the most honest kind. The men who called her a neurotic liar are mostly forgotten now. Elizabeth Bentley's name is in the history books, attached to one of the most consequential intelligence defections of the 20th century. She was right. She was right all along. And in the end, even if too late for her to see it clearly, the record shows it. That is not nothing. Or someone who spent so much of her life being told that what she knew was not true, being told that the evidence would not bear out what she was saying. That is, in its way, everything.